What was modernism?
I don't think I've ever thought about it.
I understand it to be the rejection of realism in painting or in art that came about as cities began to develop, and there was an intensified relationship of people together and the modernization of society. And in terms of its relation to my work, it's almost like it's enabled me to just kind of go back and forth, to accept it, reject it, reform it, reshape it.
What was modernism?
Well, I've always seen it as a sort of, I don't know, I suppose a sort of Belle Epoque type thing. You know, it was a wonderful period of experimentation, you know, where artists invented new techniques, materials, and probably a lot of it was probably driven by the invention of new materials. You know, it was actually the invention of the camera, oil paints in tubes, so artists could actually go out and do things, compressed charcoal, and manufactured basically art materials and things. But I mean, I always see it as starting around the mid 1800s and petering out sometime in the late 70s, early 80s.
What was modernism, and what's the impact on your work, if any?
Okay, I don't really think it's possible to make work without having a relationship to modernism. Too many of the central approaches, the ways that we even think about what it means to be an artist, are tied up with that, whether we like it or not. I think that there's aspects of how we think about what art should do and what it might be that it's not that they linger, they've never gone away. For me personally, although the angles and the facets that are on my paintings, they don't refer to Cubism, I'm a huge fan of Cubism because it changes the nature of how we think of what art does. It doesn't show us a picture, it shows us a way of thinking about something. And I think that's a crucial turning moment which has led to the developments in later modernism, and certainly impacts and influences what we see being made by anyone, anywhere, all the time. I don't think there's a way out of that. The only things that one can do if we talk about aspects of postmodernism is critique some of the fundamentals and approaches of modernism, but you're still involved with modernism.
What was modernism?
I'm not sure I know, but I think from various contexts that I've read it in or heard it in, that it is the current mode of art making which is rooted back to the middle of the 19th century, where instead of making art about tradition, one's making art about modern life, and how that's evolved until now. I mean, that's how I would.
What was modernism? I think, like anything in art, what it was is, as much as anything is, it's in a state of flux. It's sort of a compendium of mythologies. I guess in the way I tend to think of it, it is this, the things I think about it is this sort of pervasive heroism that it applied to the artist. This sort of artist as genius, I mean, typically male.
What was modernism?
Well, of course, many people will begin to answer that question by talking about painting and literature. And they'll talk about new ways of thinking about time, new ways of thinking about space, and questions of realism and figuration. But my approach has always been to this question of modernism to frame modernism in the broader context of the history of modernity. And for me, modernity is about another set of transformations that are economic, that are broadly social, about the democratization of culture, that are also about the ability to see your own world represented. So this Heidegger talked about the era of the world picture. And for me, one of the most powerful things about modernity is the distancing of the world as an experience, so that people actually started to imagine their world as if it were a representation. So things that I like to talk about when I talk about modernity are things like wax museums, which are new in the 19th century. I like to talk about the history of photography, panoramas and dioramas, which were very realistic kind of entertainments, which in a sense are the precursors to a lot of the Disneyland rides that we see today in theme parks, both at Disneyland but elsewhere, where again, real life experience is simulated. And to me, the kind of natural height of this experience of modernity and the taste for reality as a representation is the development of film in the late 19th century and the early 20th century. And of course, most people, when they think of modernism, are not really looking for realistic narratives like the movies. They're thinking about Duchamp, they're thinking about Picasso, they're thinking about Impressionist painting. But what I think is really important is also to see the corollary in entertainment culture, in commercial culture. So I think modernity includes the history of things like posters and new forms of technology like the 4-color poster. The great master of the poster is a French guy named Jules Chéret, who did amazing artwork that was also a form of advertising. So I think what you also see in modernity is the commercial aesthetic, which I think is something that we don't really have too much of before modernity, but that I think what characterizes modernity, rather than think of the avant-garde, is actually to think of the mainstream commercial culture.
What was modernism?
What was modernism? It's a very complicated question. I think everyone has a very different take on it. And of course, there's many stories. And then actually, more importantly, I would stress there are many modernisms.
Yeah.
So to define modernism is tough, but I think that in a way I was sort of raised intellectually at the Walker Art Center with the idea that you challenge that notion from the beginning, even though there is a canonical sort of version of it.
What is modernism for you?
My two main men from the 20th century were Duchamp and Cage. So I think that Duchamp dominated the first half of the century, and Cage, people caught up with him later and digested it more, and then Cage took over from the second half. And my feeling about, of course, Duchamp was that he just exploded the door. And the other artist that would mean something to me and that's involved in my work too is Malevich. I think the Russian constructivists for me in terms of painting. Picasso and Matisse, of course, are important, but didn't really move me. And Picasso's boldness and extraordinary creativity affected me in those terms. But the work itself I didn't move from. Same with Matisse.
What was modernism?
Who would have known you're going to ask that? Right, so modernism, to me, I sort of always like to link these movements and modernism for me as an artist to the way society was going. And everything I think that I am, that came from modernity, from modernism, was sort of in step with the Industrial Revolution. And the throwing off of the old, very sort of laboured, slow way of making images, a lot of rules about how to make images, very realistic, everything of realism, the idea that you are copying, that humans were showing their brilliance by copying the natural world around them. And then the Industrial Revolution came along and they discovered what iron ore could do, what they could smelt, what they could mould, how quickly they could use technology to create cameras that that got rid of the need for all of that stuff. And modernism became more about a way of defining what it is to be a human, and not as a mirror for the natural world. Does that make any sense at all?
That's great. That's perfect.
Is it right, Kit?
What was modernism?
Modernism was an historical moment in a global context where some cultures, the cultures of what we call the North Atlantic, Aryan North Atlantic cultures, Europe and America, actually confused technological and scientific progress with moral development and moral progress, and tried desperately, and sometimes effectively, sometimes less effectively, to paper over the huge gulf between the two.
What was modernism? And what does it mean to you?
Well, that's way too simple a question for a very, very broad term. And it's most simple. I associate modernism with the desire to distill, we're just talking about modernism and art, to distill art to a kind of pure form that is self-reflective, that doesn't allude, that it doesn't, it's not representational of something other than art. That I would say that's my most broad understanding. If I was going to try to get to a nutshell of what modernism is, there are so many offshoots that we still think of as say movements within modernism that stray pretty far from that precept.
What was modernism?
That.
It was a rubber machine.
Modernism was... was it modernism or modernity? Because they're two different things.
Well, exactly.
Yes. Modernism was, I would say, a set of historical attitudes and a set of ideas about the world and how the world developed that happened in a particular era that was only possible within a particular era. The big question is, did it ever stop? The big question of postmodern versus postmodern. There are many people that would say that it did, just as many that it didn't. But in any case, I would argue it was a set of attitude that included art, certainly, but included literature, film, so forth, that overlapped. Roughly one can say started with modernization, the introduction of the factory, the rise of the big capitals, industrial centers like London, Paris, and so forth, and that ended with the World War II, with the sort of wake up, World War I and World War II, which sort of made it very clear that that sort of project can lead to mass death, genocide, and destruction of life on an unprecedented scale. So I would say, in short, it was series of attitudes.
Through my childhood or my development as a person, I was very taken by this very quite formal minimalist aesthetic, the modernism. I remember seeing, for example, one of my first experiences seeing a Malevich square from Stella, black squares, and feel very puzzled by the whole thing. So it's not only about seeing more work that is starting to relate to those minimal expressions or formal expressions. So I've always been very inspired by this minimal formal vocabulary. I didn't know how they're related to that, but it makes a lot of sense. So I started really by looking at the work of Donald Judd or Art Reinhardt, Stella, Malevich, all those works. That aesthetic somehow felt like I was able to, with that aesthetic, to communicate something further than I could communicate in a figurative form.
What was modernism?
Well, I'm going to do the postmodern thing and say there's maybe a problem with your question, which is the was. And I think that that's in a lot of debate at the moment as to whether or not modernism is a particular historic era or something that is an idea which can continue and take place at any point in time. I think the jury's still out on that, but if we are to think about modernism as a series of ideas, then I think it can and has occurred across time, and I think the benefit of thinking about modernism like that is to remove it from a certain type of Eurocentrism that places London and Paris at the heart and start of what we now think of as contemporary visual culture. So I see modernism in a much broader movement of not only industrialisation, but I think actually the effects of the population centre moving from rural areas into urban populations, urban centres, which we now have the majority of the world's population lives in the city rather than in rural areas. And I think the cultural consequences of that shift is what I would say is the dominant factor of modernism.